So in terms of evolution, in terms of bringing your own genes to fruition in the future, this is pretty costly, and you can see that sexual reproduction loses in this game head-to-head. So Maynard Smith didn't, and this comes from Wikipedia. I don't always point to Wikipedia, but this is a Wikipedia page that's pretty good. Okay, so given all these things, all those bad things about sex, then why aren't most organisms asexual? Because under those just sort of simple ideas, and they've been fleshed out in some detail by lots of evolutionary biologists, asexual reproduction should win, right? Once it evolves, if an organism can do both, they ought to just go completely asexual. Okay? But it's not the case. As I showed you, sexuality is widespread. What I didn't tell you is that, in fact, most organisms reproduce sexually. And in fact, many organisms can do both, right? So many organisms can switch between sexual and asexual reproduction. So given that they can switch, why don't they just always go asexual? So that must mean that sex in and of itself probably provides some benefits that are going to overcome whatever those disadvantages, including some others that we didn't mention of asexual reproduction. Okay? Questions? So evolutionary biologists have been thinking about this for a long time, actually for more than a century. And so there are a number of theories for why sex, what we call maintaining, why sex is being maintained, persisting. There must be some reason. There must be some good reasons for sex to be maintained, because it's obviously suboptimal in many ways. And I call them the good, the bad, and the ugly. Okay, so the good, it might make some sense to you, is that one idea for the good is that sex creates variation, right? Sex that creates variation, and it's beneficial for adaptation, and Weismann at the turn of the last century put forth this idea, and then later on Ronald Fisher put forward the more explicit idea that sex actually allows the bringing together of good mutations in two individuals that otherwise might not see each other if it's asexual. Okay, so in an asexual population, they're never going to see each other if good mutations come about, but if you can bring them together every once in a while, that would work. So there's Ronald Fisher. The bad, put forth by Muller, is that sort of the flip side of the good is that deleterious mutations will actually accumulate in an asexual. So think about a Xerox copy, right? You make a Xerox copy. It looks pretty good the first time. You make a copy of the copy. It looks pretty good. You make a copy of a copy of a copy. It might start looking less good. And so that's the idea of the bad mutations. They sort of build up. And we call, and in fact, this is such a clear idea that it's actually been called Muller's ratchet. So once you're down to the 100th Xerox copy of the Xerox copy, you can't go back to the original. You've all seen these when in lecturers that have copied their notes for 20 years, right? I'd never do that. All right. So that's Hermann Muller, who won the Nobel Prize actually for mutations, actually. So he, bad stuff was sort of part of his gig. And then the ugly. So I call this the ugly. And one specific idea with the ugly is that sex is good to sort of adapt to changing environments. And the ugly part that specifically Bill Hamilton, I think, spent a lot of time talking about was parasites. So your parasites are evolving with you, and you're evolving to beat your parasites, and then your parasites keep up with you, and so you're constantly evolving. This is called the Red Queen hypothesis, and Bill Hamilton was a major part of this idea. So basically, there's all these theories, none of which have sort of taken complete hold of evolutionary biology. It might be some combination of them, and we don't. This is sort of an open question in evolutionary biology. Which one of these things, if any of them, are actually the explanation for sex? And I would suspect that probably none of them are the explanation, but some of them in combination might be provide explanations depending on what organisms we're talking about. Okay, so that's all the context. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about meiosis. So that was the sex part. So now I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of what I'm going to talk about that's research in my lab. So asking questions about when meiosis, and thus sex, arose. How did meiosis arise? And I'm going to try to answer these questions to some extent. So meiosis is a process that's a new process that arose sometime during evolution. We know that evolution works by taking advantage of previous existing functions and putting them into new jobs. So we're asking, what prior functions? What are those functions that pre-existed that got usurped, that got called into play for meiosis? Given that meiosis is there, does it stay the same? Has it always stayed the same? Or how has it evolved? A question that we're really, really interested in is, once it's evolved, once it's there, is it possible to lose it? Are we stuck? Okay? And then finally, a question which I'm going to tell you right now I'm not going to be able to answer, which is, what are the consequences of understanding all this stuff in this persistence, this maintenance of sex? I think there's something to be said in the future about this, but and it motivates the work, but this is a very deep question in evolutionary biology because it remains an open question. All right. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a framework for the kind of work that we do, and this is a phylogenetic tree. Okay. So this is a tree of all life, and life on this planet basically can be broken up into 3 clumps. There are 2 kinds of bacteria, what we call eubacteria. These include things like E. coli and salmonella. If you've gotten sick from food poisoning, you might have gotten salmonella. And archaebacteria, which probably you've never encountered because none of them are pathogens, but they're prokaryotes. They're single-celled organisms. They're in many ways similar to eubacteria, but they're quite distantly evolved. And then this big clump of organisms we call eukaryotes. These all have nuclear genomes. They all have linear chromosomes. They all have cells like we have. A vast majority of these things are single cells. Okay? They're single cells. They're protists, protozoa, amoebae, things like that. So you have to, they're very tiny, but they're actually much bigger than prokaryotes because they actually have that complex machinery that defines a eukaryotic cell. Things like organelles, mitochondria, stuff like that, okay? So a vast majority, all those white lines, are all single-celled, what we call protists. The organisms that we're most familiar with, animals, plants, and fungi, the big ones, are in some ways sort of latecomers on the scene of eukaryotes. So eukaryotes have been around for a really long time, and we think there's pretty darn good evidence that eukaryotes, complex single cells, evolved from less complex, smaller prokaryotic cells. So that there's a little bit of controversy, but for the most part, the data are quite consistent with eukaryotes being sort of an advanced version of a single cell. And so when I started thinking about this problem, I wanted to ask, well, among the eukaryotes, who's having sex? Okay, who's doing meiosis? And it turns out that these organisms, diplomonads, trichomonads, and microsporidia, diplomonads, trichomonads, and microsporidia. Has anybody met Giardia? Raise your... Oh, somebody's met Giardia, sorry. If you're laughing, you know. So, Giardia is that thing that you are afraid of when you go backpacking. You have to filter your water, or else you're going to get sick. These are organisms that looks like, based on this phylogenetic tree that's based on a gene that everybody has, might have diverged early in eukaryotic history. Okay? The cool thing about these organisms, at least 10 years ago, was that they weren't known to have meiosis. People have been looking at them. These aren't common words amongst our parlance, amongst our breakfast conversations. So people haven't really studied these very much, but people have studied them enough to have looked for things like meiosis among these organisms, and they didn't have it. So it suggested early on that maybe these organisms never had it. They were eukaryotes. They had nuclear genomes. In fact, these little things that look like eyes are actually nuclei. They have 2 nuclei instead of 1. There's a nucleus. Okay? They're clearly eukaryotes, but they seem to not have sex. So it suggested that maybe sex is something that came along later during eukaryotic evolution, right? It got invented late. That would have been great, except for when there are 2 things that happen. First of all, we begin looking at constructing these trees of life from other kinds of molecular markers, including proteins, and all of a sudden those organisms that seemed to branch early in eukaryotic evolution didn't. Okay? Science moves on. The other thing is that we started learning more and more about the presence of meiosis amongst a wider variety of taxa. So opisthocons are animals and fungi and some protists, some single cells. Amoebozoa, these are all amoebae. Plants are plants. and some green algae, some other protists, some protists, and some protists, and some protists. Okay? So most of eukaryotic diversity are single-celled protists. Okay? But it turns out when you sort of think about the fact that it didn't look like things like Giardia branched early, plus the distribution of sex along this tree was a little bit more complex, it led people to start talking in about 2004 that this last common ancestor, so these are all prokaryotes, eubacteria and archaebacteria, that this common ancestor of all eukaryotes was pretty much a eukaryote. It had a nucleus. It had organelles called the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi. So these are organelles that move things around within cells. And it underwent two important processes, mitosis and meiosis. Okay? We went on a few years later to sort of show this by looking at lots of genes, and I'll show you some of those data. But that's actually the answer. Is that this initial answer turned out to be wrong? That meiosis, in fact, was a process that defined early eukaryotic evolution. All right. So let's go back just for a minute and talk about what we know about meiosis. So there's that blue slide that I showed you before. There's all those eukaryotes up here. And all I've done is taken this portion and splay it out on the side, okay? Just to show you, most of these things on here are protists. And there you are with your fungal friends, okay? So animals and fungi are just this sort of twig on the tree of eukaryotic life, okay? And the reason why I show you that is that what we know about how meiosis works comes almost entirely from that part of the tree, okay? So what we want to understand about how meiosis evolves is by taking what we know here and then spreading it across the rest of the tree by looking for genes that are shared that carry out that process. So this is now blowing up that little purple part. So there's some fungi, things like Saccharomyces cerevisiae. It's called baker's yeast, but we all know what it really is used for, brewing beer. Anyway, various fungi, including mushrooms. There we are, humans are pretty close relatives of the mouse, and Drosophila, fruit flies, and worms. We have a worm researcher in the audience. And so what we know about how meiosis works comes from a lot of different animals, plants, and animals and fungi, and a little bit from plants. But still, that only represents a little bit of the tree of life. Okay? Is everybody following? These trees are a little bit complex, but I'm trying to don't think about the details. Just sort of try to follow the generalities. So now I'm going to show you a little bit that splayed out version of that tree that I showed you before, where there's animals and fungi and some protists, and there's plants and some protists, and then these are the rest of those protists that I've got in here. And what I'm showing you are boxes around animals and fungi and plants to demonstrate that those are the groups of organisms that we know something about how meiosis works. What are the yellow boxes? The yellow boxes represent organisms where we have genome sequences. And so what we want to do is we want to take what we know about genes that are shared, that we know work in meiosis in animals, plants, and fungi, and we ask, are those genes also present in those other organisms? And that will tell us something about whether meiosis is present or how meiosis might work in those organisms. Okay?